The one janitor recently uploaded a video called "Is It Okay to Punch a Nazi?", where he said, yes, it is okay to punch a Nazi. But in defense of this conclusion, he brought up some pretty crap arguments, and I'm being generous with that description. We'll see why. The first thing he says is that it's okay to censor people who don't play by the rules and present some kind of argument to support their position, or otherwise who don't want to engage in a debate. And to an extent I can understand this. It's kind of like a video game where the boss has nothing to hit, so you'll never beat it. Why even include that in the game? To be more specific, he's saying that if a person isn't going to engage in an argument and is just stating their position, then their speech doesn't fall under the protection of the free exchange of ideas.
But if a guy like that gets on TV, facts and arguments are no longer relevant. Richard Spencer and the alt-right are completely subverting the entire concept of the exchange of ideas. He doesn't care about facts or arguments. He's a fucking Nazi. What kind of arguments are you gonna make? Oh, actually the Nazis were bad, and whites aren't a superior race. But I'm sure that Spencer and his followers know that it's an oxymoron. That's what I'm talking about. You can't defeat them in a battle of ideas because they're not playing by the rules.
Mommy, they're not playing by the rules! Mommy, the boss in my video game doesn't periodically expose its underbelly. Whatever shall I do?
Make your move! She's a girl. What do I grab her?
Okay, janitor, I know that you've been in this corner of YouTube long enough to know this, but I guess I'm gonna have to re-explain it. Rational debate is not the only way to fight against bad ideas. Parody, relevant facts, and even simply asking the right questions are also very effective ways of showing the flaws in ideas and preventing their spread. If a Nazi says something like, "White people are smarter than black people," yeah, that's not really an argument, but you can still refute that statement. We've actually studied this, and when you account for factors like educational differences, there is no measurable race gap in intelligence. This is a totally viable way to fight against bad ideas that don't present a formal argument, at least enough to curtail their spread, that is, which the one janitor said is his goal.
We're not trying to change their mind. That's probably unlikely. We're trying to contain unacceptable ideas by disincentivizing, if not outright preventing, their propagation.
Another strategy, which I mentioned, is simply to ask the right questions to expose pitfalls and oversights that an idea might have. For example, one of my favorite videos in the abortion debate is where a man went up to a bunch of protesters with their "abortion is murder" signs, and he simply asked them, if abortion were illegal, what do you think the punishment should be for getting one?
We asked them what should happen to women who would get abortions if abortions were to become illegal.
It shouldn't be legal.
It shouldn't be legal.
No, of course not.
And if it was illegal, should there be a penalty for the women who get abortions illegally?
I don't know. I haven't thought about that one.
Well, usually when things are illegal, there's a penalty attached.
Sure.
And you can see how foolish this simple question made this person and their position look. But notice, there was no debate, there was no formal argument, just an inconvenient question. Now, of course, these strategies are unlikely to change the minds of the people espousing these ideas, and even a solid counter-argument may not do the trick, but it makes the people listening a lot less susceptible to these ideas and prevents their spread. What George W. Bush said in ignorance, I say with evidence. Mission accomplished. But if you're using this standard of "they're not playing by the rules" to justify censorship, then Nazism is not the last thing on the chopping block. Flat Earth theory, creationism, New Age beliefs, and pretty much anything where the people just say, yeah, that's just kind of how I feel, is on the chopping block for censorship. I doubt the one janitor is willing to get on that train, even though he's just bought the ticket for it. I mean, hell, if this is the standard by which we say what we can and cannot censor, then tell me, when was the last time a protester held up a picket sign which very clearly outlined their entire argument in such a way that it could be debated? Well, guess we get to censor picket signs because they're not playing by the rules. Hate it as much as you want to, but the right to free speech does not come with the obligation to engage in a debate or to present any arguments at all. And this is totally fine by me because there are other ways to fight against bad ideas. I don't have to resort to violence. The second big idea that the janitor appeals to in his video is the idea that some speech is, as he puts it, actually unacceptable. But he never really explains what makes an idea go from being just unacceptable to actually unacceptable.
There are very, very few things that I think are unambiguously, no room for argument, unacceptable. But being an open, unabashed Nazi white supremacist just happens to be one of those things. There are people out there who consistently say dumb, untrue, and harmful things, like, for example, the majority of people who work at Fox News. But this seems to me to be very clearly different. This goes beyond saying something that's mean or untrue or hurtful. This is like something that's actually unacceptable, like should not exist. I disagree with a lot of people on a lot of things, and the vast majority of those things I'm perfectly fine with allowing you to openly express. But in my view, there are a few things, a very small number of things, but a few things nonetheless, that are just simply unacceptable. Some ideas are just unacceptable and we have to prevent their propagation.
So what exactly is the difference between speech that is simply unacceptable and speech that is actually unacceptable? How are these two things very clearly different? He doesn't actually explain this, so I'm just going to have to try and figure it out. Per the first part of my video, I noticed that he said multiple times that ideas which don't present any targets or are just assertions are okay to censor. So I thought, maybe that's the standard he's using to determine what makes something actually unacceptable. But if I said something like, I think all humans should wear bunny ears when they're out in public, that's just my opinion, nothing you say will convince me otherwise, I doubt that the one janitor would say that that idea is actually unacceptable in the same way that being a Nazi is actually unacceptable. So I don't think that's the standard he's using to differentiate unacceptable ideas from actually unacceptable ideas. To be perfectly honest, I think he's making this distinction solely based on how emotionally disgusted he is with one idea over another. And to an extent, I do understand this. When the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Westboro Baptist Church had the right to protest soldiers' funerals under free speech, I was mad. I thought, yeah, that's actually unacceptable. In fact, if you had asked me at the time, I would have said, yeah, that's totally not acceptable. You can't protest at someone's fucking funeral, you fucking animal. But that is not an argument. I had to realize that the Westboro Baptist Church is simply the most extreme example of just how far free speech goes in this country. I personally wish that such an example would stay relegated to an interesting thought experiment instead of a real group of people, but it was not meant to be. I've known a few people in my life who act a lot like I think the one janitor is acting, where you can have a deep and probing philosophical conversation with them, but only to a point. At some point, they just can't get past their emotions, and they will abruptly abandon their principles as soon as their conclusion becomes unpalatable enough. They don't simply say, oh, well, that's an interesting dead end, or that's a really unpalatable conclusion. They simply declare the conclusion to be out of bounds, or, in this case, actually unacceptable.
I have to admit, my initial knee-jerk emotional reaction to seeing an openly racist demagogue get punched in the face is, I'm cool with that. 'Cause fuck that guy. But a knee-jerk emotional reaction is not good enough for me. I have to sit down and think about how I really feel about that.
How I really feel about that. I don't think I'm nitpicking semantics here. I think he knows what he said. It's not what he thinks about it, it's not what his principles dictate in spite of his emotions, it's how he feels about it. And here's just the icing on the cake. Janitor, you started off this video by saying that ideas which are not accompanied by arguments should not count as free speech on the basis of exchanging ideas. But then you introduced this idea that some things are actually unacceptable with no supporting arguments, except presumably how you feel about it. Can you not see how you've contradicted yourself in this one video?
What kind of arguments are you gonna make? Oh, actually the Nazis were bad, and whites aren't a superior race. Oh shit, I didn't even think about that. My bad.
What kind of arguments are you gonna make to someone who just asserted that some ideas are actually unacceptable? Oh, actually, there's no such thing as unacceptable speech as long as it doesn't call for violence.
Oh shit, I didn't even think about that. My bad.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.
The third big idea in the janitor's video has to do with the type of ban that he wants. And actually, he and Steve Shives both make the distinction between the government banning ideas and those ideas simply being socially castrated. And I think this is an important distinction to make, primarily because it has to do with whether or not force is legally allowed. A social ban usually only carries the stigma or the penalty of being yelled at or being shamed, and force is still illegal. You can't physically block someone from getting an abortion. You can protest outside the clinic all you want, but as soon as you start pushing them away, that's illegal. whereas a government ban and government enforcement of censorship uses, well, force. And I think that the difference between government banning something and people just socially agreeing to ban something really breaks down when you say, yeah, citizens are totally allowed to use force to censor ideas.
But this wasn't a government retaliation upon Richard Spencer. This was just an individual citizen who took it upon himself to sock him in the face. By the way, good on him for leading with the elbow. The bones in your hand are fragile.
Do we want the state stepping in and saying that there are certain things we just can't say, no matter how vile those things might be? No, I don't think most of us would want that. But does that mean that every propagator of every theory and ideology is entitled to a platform and an audience?
Some ideas are just unacceptable and we have to prevent their propagation. And I still think the legal right to free speech is important, so it's not up to the government to do this. It's up to the citizens to facilitate this. We want them to fear the social consequences of being an awful person. Those consequences could include being ostracized or ridiculed, or they could include being punched in the face.
I don't want the government censoring ideas. I just want to live in a world that effectively functions the same way, but with the assurance that the enforcers are people who think like me. And finally, in what is probably the dumbest assertion yet, the janitor appeals to something that you might call predicted violence, in order to justify violent reactions against ideas.
But I think it could be argued that some ideas and actions are inherently or potentially violent, even when they don't directly cause physical harm to anyone. Like, I don't know, the idea of ethnic cleansing. And if that's the case, then self-defense might apply here.
The assertion that speech is violence isn't really new, but I have the same question for the janitor that I have for all of these people, which is, just how far in the future are you allowed to predict violence and still call your violent retaliation self-defense? If, for example, someone says that GMOs are bad, and I am reasonably convinced that if this idea becomes mainstream it will lead to mass starvation, am I allowed to punch them in the face? In the United States, we have a legal precedent called clear and present danger for when violence is an acceptable reaction by citizens. We're talking about minutes and seconds here, with concrete cues that violence is imminent, not years and decades combined with your personal social theories. And as with all good things in life, Star Trek summarized this point beautifully.
I don't know what's going on out here. But you should, Picard. You know what it's like to be under fire.
You weren't under fire.
Lives were at stake.
Whose lives?
We had to act now.
Why?
Yeah, fucking why? Explain yourself, janitor, and explain yourself with something better than, some ideas are just unacceptable. Alright, let's get this train wreck wrapped up.
We want them to fear the social consequences of being an awful person. Those consequences could include being ostracized or ridiculed, or they could include being punched in the face. And no, we're not trying to change their mind. That's probably unlikely. We're trying to contain unacceptable ideas by disincentivizing, if not outright preventing, their propagation.
Censoring ideas to the point where people are afraid to voice them is kind of like quarantining a horrible disease, except for the fact that you don't actually know where it's quarantined, and you also don't know whether or not it's still spreading because you've suppressed the symptoms with, effectively, Tylenol. It'll work while the disease is small, but if it continues to spread, you won't be able to suppress it for much longer. However, allowing bad ideas to exist while challenging them in the ways I described is a lot like vaccination. I've seen this before. I know where it's weak. We need to let bad ideas die with their hosts, yes, but we can't do this by quarantining them. That just doesn't work. We can do this by vaccinating the fence-sitters and the ignorant people so that when they encounter these ideas by themselves, they already know what questions to ask and what vulnerabilities they might want to probe, even if they initially do so in the hopes that these ideas are actually stronger than people led them to believe. And tell me, janitor, Shives, how successful has your refusal to engage with your opponents been in reducing those ideas? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that over the last 5 years or so, this part of YouTube has only become more and more right-leaning. For example, back in 2012 and maybe earlier, my arguments for not allowing Christian bakers to refuse service to a gay couple would have been roundly applauded. But in my recent video on the subject, I was lampooned by social and economic conservatives. Refusing to engage with opposing ideas is no different from refusing to vaccinate your kids. And then you're left to wonder, why is my community having so many outbreaks? Censorship is the cause. You are the cause. You are only giving ammunition to your enemies, to my enemies, and you really need to cut it out and start to actually talk.